Homage to all the Buddhas, homage to all the Dharmas, homage to the Bodhisattva ancestors. Reverend Master Jiyu would say that there are nothing that one has to believe in blindly when coming to Buddhism. However, she did say there was 3 acts of faith. That's faith that the Buddha found something true, that truth has been passed down through the centuries and is being taught accurately or lived accurately at the present times. You can call that Buddha, Dharma and Sangha, the 3 treasures. If you don't have faith in the basic truth of coming from Shakyamuni Buddha's understanding, his awakening, then there's really no basis for this practice. So faith is clearly foundational both to our practice and in Zazen. As I talked about before, it takes faith to keep on returning to the river of life, allowing of samsara, allowing the flotsam and jetsam, the flowers, you might say in a poetic way, to melt away like frost and dew in the sun of wisdom. And that's from a quote that I will give you the full quote another day. Or as one of our offertories sung at the end of a ceremony goes, the flowers of the mind, that's the converting of the flotsam and jetsam, the flowers of the mind bloom in the springtime of enlightenment. Yes, flowery language. However, those words are pointing to a truth. Flotsam and jetsam, like an island of plastic floating out in the ocean, as we hear so much about, converted into the sea of the lotuses symbolizing enlightenment. Yeah, religion and often employs poetic language to help us to be pushed past our intellect, and using symbolism, one thing standing for another, can help. So whether or not the story of Shakyamuni, son of the Shakya clan, putting his bowl in the river of Naranjara and it floating upstream is true or not, it serves as a symbol of practice right now. I'm right there seeing the bowl float up the river Naranjana. And any time we decide to turn around, like the bowl, and act out of faith rather than fear, we are effectively floating upstream against the tide, know it or not. And in so doing, hearing less of our own voice, so to speak, of fear, and something more subtle. And so in doing out of conscious awareness, we are acting on a sense that there must be more to life and living than this. A sense that for some is very acute, others just a vague thought. And I think all beings have all beings do have the capacity to reflect on life and living and actions. So at base, life can feel somewhat unsatisfactory, even when the weather's good, the internal or external weather is good. There's something somewhat unsatisfactory. And dukkha, as many of you know, is the Sanskrit word translated as suffering or unsatisfactoriness. And whether pushed from behind by pain and one's life experience or experiences, or pulled from in front by the promise or the imagined promise of something better, something causes us, something prompts us, an inner prompting perhaps, causes us to find a solution to that niggling sense of unsatisfactoriness, which, as I say, comes and goes. And the solution, meditation and Buddhism, is not the only one. I think everybody's dipped into and committed to programs of self-improvement, of exercise of various kinds and disciplines. And these practices are certainly of a help. But improvement isn't ultimately satisfactory. Perhaps we feel more comfortable by comparison to when we started. And self-improvement or other teachings, I came through the route of Krishnamurti, is frequently a step towards religion. Not always, but sometimes. Buddhism was not Buddhism back then in India, obviously. There was a lad, alone, on a mission to find the cause of suffering. And indeed, when he had found that, on seeing the morning star, it says, he found it for himself, he exclaimed, and this is really quite an important statement. Well, it's, again, really important. He said, I am, and will be enlightened together with all living things. That's past, present and future, including all living things. This implies there is not a separate person or a soul that is enlightened individually at a specific time. And this was a radical statement at the time when Hinduism espoused the Atman, separate soul. And the Shakyamuni discovered through his personal experience no separate soul, anatta. And that anatta marks out Buddhism and maybe why it ended up being called Buddhism, because Buddha Shakyamuni became the awakened one, and that's the term used for a Buddha. The awakened one. It obviously wasn't a concept about truth, he knew it, had become it really. He had become awakened and seen into the fact of no separation. Then following that was the teaching of the path or the way that he gave at his first sermon in Vulture Peak, explaining the path out of suffering and its causes. They came through the Four Noble Truths. Even his ascetic companions joined him to follow what is called the Buddha middle way. That's between asceticism and indulgence. And I expect he was ragged for going soft on them by on the ascetics, his companions along the way. And they were inspired by the changed person he'd become, so they joined him. And so, far from rejecting him for having gone soft, they thought, he's found something important. We'll listen to him. We'll hear what he's got to say. And I have to say, quite often people come to practice inspired by changes in a friend, or they meet a teacher, you meet a teacher, hear the teaching spoken or written scriptures for that matter. So something prompts us internally and externally too. Probably a combination of both, really. And now I'm returning to, the journey that we all make, or have all made, to the monastery. And I'm talking specifically about the week-long retreat of Jukai. And however well prepared one is when setting out for Jukai, at the end it is in actual fact an act of faith. You're going from home, which is known and safe, relatively speaking, and hopefully safe, to the unknown, potentially risky, week-long retreat. I would say it's not physically risky, but I would say emotionally challenging for sure, and physically challenging, and really you're travelling into the unknown. You might say going from the light of the known to the unfamiliar. Which, from the light of day to the darkness of who knows what. And those of you who've read the Sandokai will remember this line, light goes with darkness as the sequence does of steps in walking. And the light refers to the light of day, the light of samsara, you might say. And the darkness refers to the inner part of ourselves that is not illuminated in quite the same way as the light of day of everyday life, often referred to as the darkened hall within. Reverend Master Ji, you would describe that as velvety black. We often associate dark and black with pain and suffering. I'm having some dark times now. I'm in a dark place. But actually, we're using dark and light in a different kind of way. And during in the setups of Jukai, the going from the light of everyday life in the monastery to the darkness of meditation, and or the physical darkness, which is how the ceremonies are set up, symbolic of, and not only symbolic, and actually helping to bring those there inwards. So the second ceremony, let's call it, if we call the first one the journey, the making the commitment, and the following, inner prompting. The second is the reading of the precepts, which is hearing the celebrant speaking in a really very dark room, purposefully made dark, just with candlelight. The altar lights are not on. So in the darkness of meditation and the hall, one hears, perhaps for the first time, although not the actual first time, the teachings of the precepts, which point to ways in which an enlightened person would wish to act. And at the end, there is the lone voice of the celebrant who represents Shakyamuni. And will you keep these precepts or not? And then everybody chooses to answer collectively as one voice, I will. That too is an act of faith, because you just don't know what it is really and truly you're committing to. So, deciding to formally commit to the Buddhist precepts by coming to Jukai is responding to a vague call, you might say, either within or from somebody or something that's called to you. And sometimes it just seems like a good idea, a good step. Little anecdote from me here. Reflecting on my journey, I was driving up by car from the south of England, Wales, and remembering thinking as I drove, yep, I agree with those precepts. I agree with them. They seem like a good plan. And the next thought within a heartbeat was, no, I don't agree with them, I accept them. And that's quite a turnaround, really, if you think about it. Agreeing and accepting. Accepting takes it on one. And I also wondered, before ever coming to Jukai, but I thought I'd throw this in anyway, what all the talk about the self was, about the ego, about letting go of self. Letting go of self since I'd grown up to negate myself. Ego wasn't even in the picture. Such was the way girls were raised back then in the 50s and 60s. We deferred our own needs to the needs of others, really, not just men, but others. However, I had sensed a wall-to-wall veil or illusion. Yes, like a semi-translucent veil or over my perception of my world, or feeling rather like an actor in a film with me as the main character. It didn't kind of have the ring of truth. I can only say I had not a clue how to break through this, and that anyway it was only a vague, very vaguely understood and perceived. It was kind of weird. It's one that I had from early life. And I always had an interest in the functioning of the senses. Perhaps that's why I clued into this veil, if you like. And it turns out formal meditation ended up an answer. The precepts pointed through the wall of illusion. It took me a while to kind of get that, many, many years actually after becoming a monk. As I said at the end of the talk yesterday, I thought when I sat down for the first time, and I swear one of those blocks is actually in the guest cottage wall, it's so clear to me. Oh my goodness, this is really important when I sat down. And of course it was. Little did I know, but something new. So we all come at training as individuals, with our own, as Rev Master Ji would term it, grab bag, like shopping bag you might say, or handbag, our inheritance you might say, our historic inheritance. Another aspect of the journey to Jukai reflects in a number of the ceremonies, is the lone voice of the celebrant, and then the collective response. You're hearing a voice outside of your head, and then if you actually hear, as you speak those words, I will, and that's significant too. Everything's significant. If whilst you open your mouth and speak those words, I will, and you hear that, just as somebody said about the sound of a bird can pierce your heart, so too when you speak and hear your sincere wish or affirmation, it pierces your heart. There's so many aspects of the journey, both subtle and plainly obvious, that are reflected in the ceremonies of Jukai. It's actually been quite hard to extract them. But thinking about it now, it's not surprising that I've chosen hearing and later on I'll be talking about seeing as well, the functioning of the senses, since that was my route in. Other people will understand and teach from a different angle, depending on many factors, but including one's route in, so to speak. Route into one's heart. this sentence is a riff basically on a Christian saying, you'll probably know it or not, and that is, all are called but few choose to answer. Thus it is that hearing, in the physical sense and in the inner sense, is I use the word foundational at all points on the path. And we heard yesterday from somebody who talked about that inner hearing. Can be referred to as, I wrote a note for myself here, inner promptings, which can be on all levels of life, from the purely practical and prosaic to the inner prompting to in my case years ago to go and offer incense at Koho Zenji's grave in Japan, which I followed through on and did, and went on a religious pilgrimage. So I've chosen the plainly obvious aspect of our practice to highlight during the week, both during these talks and encouraging you to take that out into your time when not Zooming. And that is the call and response. Responding to the sounds of the instruments we use, as well as the sounds we make with our voices, specifically the words spoken aloud in response to the celebrant, in response to whoever you may be living with, in and out. And I've given you some, in attachments to your email, some chants that are used during a couple of the ceremonies. And I'll bring those in later on in the week. Yeah, all are called, few choose to answer. We say all things teach. Earth, trees, we're going poetic here. All things, trees, wooden posts, carrots, wise teachers, loud gongs. Only when we are prepared to hear that teaching coming from all directions, within and without, within everyday living, within our sitting in the darkened hall in Zazen, are we likely to break through the sound, the unremitting sound of our own individual voice. The one thing that is so troublesome and asked about when sitting in Zazen. How do I deal with the voices in my head? It could be images, it could be music too. The sound of our own voice. Are we prepared to hear? Not reach out and listen, but allow the sound to come to us, not to go out to it. and to hear the fullness of sound, fullness of silence, which underlies the illusions. To know from the Udana scripture, the unborn, undying, unconditioned, uncreated. We just have to get out of our own way, basically. Homage to the Buddha, homage to the Dharma, homage to the Sangha. The Dharma of a Dharma talk is actually the sound of the speaker's voice. And you're truly hearing it. And if in hearing it, the forms, the words, touch your heart, that is entirely due to you and not to the speaker of the words.